Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality.
Good. Well, I was going to say good afternoon, or I don't know what it is where you're listening to this podcast, but perhaps more helpfully, hello and welcome to the Living Out podcast. If we haven't met before, you don't know my dulcet tones. I'm Ed Shaw. I'm the ministry director at Living Out, and for some reason, I've been given the responsibility of kicking off our new series on friendship, which is, I hope, going to be a fantastic series as we talk about one of the greatest gifts that God has given us in creation, the gift of friendship. And I'm joined today by a familiar voice and a new voice. I'll introduce them in a moment. But first of all, let's just explain why we're doing this series on friendship. I reckon friendship is one of the least talked about and enjoyed gifts that God has given us. And in both society around us and actually sadly within church circles, we don't often sit and talk about the gift of friendship and what a joy it can be. Instead, I think our focus is probably often on matching people up in romantic friendships, finding out who somebody's partner is, who they might like to be going out with, who the new love of their life might or might not be. We very rarely sit down and talk about friendship, either in wider society or in churches. And we are here to try and change that as much as we possibly can with a whole series, amazingly, series 11 on friendship. And we hope it's going to be helpful for you if you're same-sex attracted. We hope it's going to be helpful for you if you're single. We hope it's going to be helpful for you if you're married. In fact, we're hoping this would be helpful for every single person that listens in as we think about friendship, what it is, why it matters, and how to do it well. I mentioned we've got a familiar voice and a new voice on this episode. The familiar voice is Andy Robinson, who's going to say hello now.
Hello now.
Brilliant, thank you. Oh, that's why I so enjoy having Andy Robinson as one of my friends. Excellent. The new voice, much to my relief, a new voice on this podcast is Phil Knox. Phil, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, my name is Phil. I'm an evangelist and missiologist, which means I am someone who hopefully brings good news to people, but also someone who tries to kind of understand the pathways by which people become Christians and try and help the whole church make the most of those pathways so we might see people meet Jesus.
Brilliant. And you work for a wonderful organisation called the Evangelical Alliance that we're part of here at Living Out. And actually tell us about the Sharing Jesus work that you do, because I just think that's so exciting and not enough people know about that. So just do you want to do a quick little advert for the Sharing Jesus stuff before we go on to anything else?
Yeah, so one of the things that we really engage with is around research, around what kind of non-Christians think about Christians and what Christians think about evangelism and how people who've become Christians, kind of what's happened along those journeys to faith. And so the most exciting part of that, which I can tell you about, is over the summer, we did a piece of research where we tried to find 100 people who'd become Christians as adults in the last 5 years and asked about their journey to faith. We didn't find 100, we found 280. So we were just blown away by the number of people who'd become Christians. And there's just some fascinating themes in there. We were really encouraged by the breadth of ages, the breadth of backgrounds, but also it was a bit discouraging from an evangelist's point of view, because it turns out lots of people are jumping into the boat without our help, which is encouraging on one level, but also the importance of friendship, which we'll talk about a bit today, but lots of things to be encouraged by.
Great. So go onto the Evangelical website if you're in the UK or anywhere else and just find their Sharing Jesus material. Absolutely fantastic. And the reason we got Phil on this podcast is that he himself has written a book on friendship called The Best of Friends, published by IVP here in the UK. And I guess we'll be talking about that. I was going to try and read the whole thing before we had this podcast. I've got to confess to being 2 chapters in, but I really enjoyed those 2 chapters and are looking forward to reading the rest. But it means that when I ask this question, I can't quite yet answer with this book because I haven't finished it yet. But my question is, what is your favourite book on friendship? This might soon be it, but at the moment, not yet because I haven't finished it. But what's your favourite book on friendship? Phil, you must have read a lot of books on friendship to write a book on friendship. What is your favourite book on friendship?
Yeah, I mean, what's fascinating is actually when we started this conversation about the kind of neglect of friendship in our world, there's actually not many books on friendship out there. A little bit like when you try to come up with a song around friendship, there are just reams on romantic relationships, not so much on friendship. But I think of all that I've read, I think my favourite is a book by a guy called Max Dickens called Billy No Mates, which is particularly about male friendship. And he wrote this book, which is just really fun. It's not a Christian book. He wrote a book, he's a comedian. And he wanted to get married, but couldn't think of a friend who was close enough to him to be his best man. So it was like, really looked into the crisis around male friendship, and it's really funny, but it's also painfully vulnerable in exposing the crisis in our world. So it was part of my inspiration, really, to delve deeper into this subject matter. But there's loads out there. I mean, C.S. Lewis, The Four Loves, if you want to go a bit deeper. Robin Dunbar's written a book just simply called Friends, which is about the science of friendship. But I think Billy No Mates was probably the one I enjoyed the most.
Great. Oh. Well, there we are. Andy Robinson, what's your favourite book on friendship?
I enjoyed recently reading Vaughan Roberts' book on friendship, which interestingly actually points back to an older work, Aelred and Spiritual Friendship, by a sort of ancient book, which was fascinating. But I guess also I love reading, novels and so on, where you just see sort of friendship modelled. It sort of probably never occurred to me at the time, but growing up reading kind of Sherlock Holmes type stuff, it's quite interesting reflecting on the kind of friendship that you see as sort of Holmes and Watson and so on. So as well as reading books on friendship, probably as I've got older, you just notice what friendship looks like in other works as well, and I've enjoyed pondering on that a little bit. What about you, Ed?
Oh, I thought you'd never ask. I mean, novels, actually. Wallace Stegner's book, Crossing to Safety, is a beautiful American novel about friendship, which I love. But I think, actually, John Wyatt's Transforming Friendship, which must have come out about the same time as Phil's book, are really, really helpful about intergenerational friendships, which I think is something that we sort of, I think often when people think friendship, we're sort of trapped into you'll be friends with your peers. And John Wyatt's written a great book about his friendship with John Stott, who was his dad's age, and how wonderfully God used that and encouraging us to all develop intergenerational friendships. Well, great to hear about books that we've written on friendship or that we've read on friendship, but let's sort of try and get the live wisdom on this podcast on what actually friendship is. So, Phil, how would you define friendship? What are we actually talking about as we begin this podcast series on friendship?
Well, it's either a cop-out or it's a great example of friendship. My best definition of friendship comes from a friend of mine who says that a friend is someone you can talk to, depend on, grow with, and enjoy. And I love that as a really kind of encapsulating definition of those kind of four elements: talk to, depend on, grow with, and enjoy. Because I think the challenge is with defining friendship is it kind of covers such a broad range of intimacies. I got out an Uber the other day and said, "Thanks very much, my friend." And yet at the same time, I've got some friends who I've journeyed with over decades. The Uber driver won't be getting an expensive present for Christmas, but my best mate might. Do you know what I mean? And I think there's that real tension in friendship where they're kind of, they're made in a moment but forged over a lifetime. And we have to live in that tension. But I love that definition, really, kind of someone you can talk to, someone you can really depend on. The Uber driver I'm probably not going to depend on apart from, to get me from A to B. Someone I can grow with, who I'll walk alongside through the seasons of life. But also, let's not miss the fun and the enjoyment of friendship as well. That's a really key component.
Andy, what would you add to that?
I've always found some of the stuff, the language that Jesus used around friendship, really interesting. So the night before he dies, he's with his disciples in John's Gospel, and he calls them friends. And he says, the reason I call you friends is because everything God's given me, I've revealed to you, I've made known to you. And that's quite interesting theologically. But it's interesting as essentially is defining friendship as openness, a kind of revealing stuff to people. And I've just found that tremendously useful over the years because, as Phil said, there are acquaintances where I'm doing sort of polite small talk. Friends are those I'm willing to be open with and reveal stuff to, and they actually get to know me at a deeper level. And so that just struck me in passing, really. It was sort of reflecting on Jesus and think, he gives an interesting definition of friendship there that I found useful.
And it's really interesting that particularly they're being open with people, because I think that's what I've often struggled most with in friendship. Loads of people who I would see as friends, cool friends, but actually I think perhaps one of the biggest complaints my friends would make about me, not that I have a complaint department for them, is that I don't let them in. That I'm sometimes really struggling in life, but they only find out after the event. And I know that I'm not very good at actually just crying out in the midst of a busy, stressful time saying, this is what's happening. And that sort of that openness is a really key thing, but perhaps quite a hard thing for a lot of us to do. Andy, you started to talk about friendship with Jesus. One of the words, one of the phrases that is used in the Old Testament of various characters is that we as humans can be friends with God. And that feels like quite presumptuous language, doesn't it? Because I think we're so used, particularly in the Old Testament, to talk about the holiness of God, the separateness of God. He's at the centre of the temple. This idea that we could be friends with God seems a bit weird. Where would you go to sort of prove to somebody that actually we get to be friends with God? And from the Old Testament, Phil, where would you take us?
I was asked this question yesterday. I was preaching in a church yesterday and had this woman come up to me at the end and say, I'd never really looked at it like that. But I think it really is biblical. I think that it talks of Moses. Moses talked face to face with God as a man talks to a friend. But I think ultimately, I really do think this is an important lens through which we're to view our relationship with God theologically. I think A.W. Tozer says what comes to our mind when we think about God is the most important thing about us. And the Bible gives us necessarily just a beautiful range of kind of relationships to view our connection with God through kind of creator and saviour, judge, king, redeemer. But I think friend is a really important one. I think the moment where that Andy's alluded to in John 15, where Jesus says to his disciples, "I have called you friends." There's no other record of any other rabbi in the first century calling their disciples friends. You can almost see the shock on the disciples' faces when he said, "Sorry, Jesus, you've called us what?" And I think it's really intentional on Jesus' part that's a lens through which both his disciples, the 12, but also we are to view that. And I think we need to hold that intention. I think the question from the woman yesterday kind of alluded to, the Lord, the cheesy line is that he needs to be the Lord, he can't be the Lord Almighty more than the Lord Almighty. But I think that's it. We just need to hold that intention. But I think we need to make sure that friendship is a really key revealed characteristic of our friendship with God.
I think that's right, because one of the dangers for us can be we kind of assume Jesus doesn't really want to spend time with us, or Jesus slightly objects to us, or Jesus kind of feels obliged to be with us. Whereas, I call you friends. Actually, with those disciples that he was with, he says, eating the Passover meal, I really wanted to eat this meal with you before I went to the cross, and so on. And so you get this lovely image of Jesus wanting to be with his disciples, and I think that expands to us because we're his friends. And you're right, it's not the only lens through which to see our relationship with Jesus, but it's certainly got to be one of them, just as it were, to consciously receive his friendship because he wants to have us with him. And that's astonishing and wonderful and glorious.
Yeah, and I think it's linked to that choice thing as well, isn't it? You think of, I think C.S. Lewis says that friendship's so brilliant because it's the one you choose. You don't choose family stuff, but I think that kind of lens of, we choose to be friends with God. Jesus chooses to be friends with us. That kind of reciprocity of choice is just brilliant.
And I think the church I'm at Bristol, we sort of as the leadership really wanted to get our church praying more this year. And the way that we're seeking to do that actually is not just to say pray more, but actually let's think about these biblical pictures that we're given that help us to realise that actually God loves hanging out with us. And he's all ears when we speak to him. And actually, we've just done a little sermon series where we talked about your God as Father, which was most familiar, but God as Friend, which was much fresher, and I think really had an impact. But one of the questions that came back to us on that was actually, what does that feel like? What does it feel like to have God as a friend? How do you help people get a sense of what that feels like, looks like in your daily life, Phil, to have God as a friend?
Well, I mean, Andy has already stolen the best answer for this, I think. when he talks about John 15, where Jesus says, "I've called you friends because everything the Father has made known to me, I've made known to you." And I think there's just something, isn't there, about letting people in to our lives and disclosure, vulnerability. And I think one thing I've observed, I think when I think about this moment, I think about kind of teenage residential holidays in my youth group. Grew up in an amazing Christian youth group, and you'd kind of, it'd be like 1 a.m, you'd be in your bunk beds in your sleeping bag, and then someone would go, "Let me tell you about this bit of my life." And you'd almost kind of wait to see if the other person then went, "Now let me tell you a bit about mine." And what you see is this kind of beautiful, virtuous upward spiral of kind of mutual vulnerability. And I think with God, that's I think part of my experience of what it is to grow in maturity as a follower of Jesus, in terms of not only do I understand more of his heart as I kind of read his word and get to know him through prayer, but also actually he really wants to know how I'm doing. And so I think I am, at the moment, I'm prayer walking around our church every morning. And so at something like 5:30 this morning was walking around our community. And I just started by saying, Lord, I'm weary. Lord, this is a struggle. Lord, actually, I'm really excited by this. Lord, I'm doing a podcast later with this guy called Ed. It was this kind of just this is how I'm doing, God. And I think actually in terms of friendship, there's that. But then you can't also get away from time. In my book, I talk about the kind of science behind how we go deeper, how we grow our relational muscles. And one of them is time is like oxygen to friendship. Both of those things, I think, are critical for how we relate and what it means to be a friend of God.
I guess there's just a deep sense of security there as well. So actually, I'm loving the fact that we're bouncing around John 15 because it's there. Jesus speaks, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for one's friends, and you're my friends. And so I love the fact that when we spend time with Jesus, we're coming to one who we know loves us, and there's a security there. I guess with people I don't know very well, I can often fail, but try to kind of want to impress them with my, I don't know, eloquence or humour or something. Whereas actually, it is that sense when I'm just hanging around with friends. I know they already love me. I don't need to impress them. I don't need to achieve anything with them. And I love the fact that as we come to Jesus, we don't need to, in a sense, we can't impress him. We just have the security of being loved, which gives us the freedom to be honest and so on.
And that's important, and that encouragement to be honest, because I know that actually my problem with my human friends is I'm not honest enough with them. But actually one of my problems with my relationship with God is that I'm not honest with him either. Which is ridiculous, isn't it? Because he knows exactly what I'm thinking, feeling, going through. But actually, I don't tell him that. And I think so often I will be thinking resentfully, oh, God doesn't feel that close to me. He doesn't feel like a close friend. And it's because I haven't poured out my heart to him in a long time. I haven't told him exactly what I'm feeling, whether that's joy, bitterness, anger, love, whatever it might be. It's just being open and honest with him and feeling you really can do that. You don't have to come up with a perfect liturgical prayer to actually talk to God. You can just pour your heart out, as it sounds as if Phil was doing at 5:30 this morning.
But I think that what I'd also say on that, I think there's mutual things we can apply to our friendship with people and friendship with God. So I think sometimes we kind of think that what the friendship language does is it gives us a really helpful kind of lens through which to say, well, actually, how does God receive love? Well, actually, in lots of ways, our best friends receive love. And I think especially that time piece, and again, back down to kind of when we do that, there are some friendships where you need to put in the diary time with a friend to make it happen, otherwise it doesn't happen. And I find it depends on your personality, but I'm the same. If it gets to midday and I've not spent some time with the Lord, it's going to be a struggle. So actually, those rhythms of relationship, I think, can be really, really helpful.
We are so excited about Kaleidoscope, the series that gives you the chance to wrestle with big questions about sexuality, gender, and faith.
People often ask us, are you kind of living a lie because of my sexuality?
I was always rebelling against this idea of being a female, I think because I felt so different from the other girls.
Kaleidoscope is a video-based series for use in youth groups designed to help young people explore big questions on sexuality, gender and faith.
The actual relationship that I left in order to follow Jesus was with a woman that I intended to spend the rest of my life with.
Each episode has real-life stories, engaging teaching and a panel discussion. And alongside the videos, there's training, episode guides, take-home sheets and a load of bonus material for use before and after the series, giving churches everything they need to help young people explore these big topics.
And when I became a Christian, read the Bible for myself, I saw, no, you know what, there's actually a much bigger story going on here.
We turn to him as sinners, and actually he responds with grace and with love.
So we've talked about the joy of friendship with God. Does that mean we actually don't need human friends? And because some people might say actually this is we've got this great relationship with God, really intimate relationship with Him. He's our best friend. We should be we get to be friends with Him. As a result of that, do we actually need other human friends in our lives? Is it really that important? Is there a biblical case for us actually needing other people apart from God? Phil, I know you've written on this because I've read this part of your book.
Well, I was going to say, Ed, I can't believe you're asking that question, because if you've only read 2 chapters, one of them is why friendship matters so much. So I think we've unpacked a bit of the kind of theological basis, but I also love the creation narrative where 8 times things are good or very good in God's eyes. The first thing that's not good is for us to be alone, and just then from Genesis to Revelation, the biblical pattern is always relational. It's always community. But then that's backed up in the way our bodies are wired. The medically, isolation is so bad for us. You can live terribly unhealthily, but if you've got good friends, you'll live longer than someone who's socially isolated but keeps himself in shape. Now, for the record, the position of Phil Knox and the Evangelical Alliance and Living Out is that you should have good friends and keep yourself in shape.
I'm not sure you can speak for Living Out on that one.
I think you might have some medics on your case if you say otherwise. But if you're going to choose one, have good friends. So I think there's real physical benefits in that. But I think also within the church, what I've observed, all the research around discipleship is that we need others to spur each other on. I think the enemy's goal is to isolate us and to divide us. As a missiologist, I can tell you most people come to faith through friends. And the church, in terms of its beauty, in terms of its diversity, and actually, I think in terms of the healing to our broken and divided world at the moment, I think the way that the church is friends and needs to raise the volume of the conversation on friendship is really important.
Andy, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I mean, sort of biblically, the passage that I've always found striking is right at the end of 2 Timothy, actually. Paul's in prison, probably about to die, actually. And you can imagine Paul will say, oh, it's all right, God's with me, and he does say that. But he also says, Timothy, please come. And it's just a lovely picture, actually, of Paul in prison, on his own, probably coming to the end of his life, saying, I want my friend with me. And that's where I've always gone, just in terms of thinking, actually, even if you have a brilliant relationship with God, you still need human friends as well. It's what we're designed for. And it's funny, I was sort of speaking on, history of living with same-sex attraction and so on, an event this weekend, and I just found myself saying the 2 things the Lord has used to keep hold of me over those years. One has been just, I trust he's holding on to me by the power of his Spirit. The second is good friends. Those are the 2 things God has used to keep hold of me. And in a sense, it is both that vertical friendship and those horizontal friendships are just vital for us. And my life has been much harder when I haven't had those friends around, or I've just not invested time in those friendships.
Yeah, those vulnerable moments in Scripture are really beautiful, aren't they? As you were saying, I was thinking about the moment in John 6 maybe where Jesus says, "Are you going to leave me too?" And there's a kind of you hear the kind of intonation, and I love that moment in 2 Timothy 2. Yeah, thanks, Andy. That's great.
Okay, so I'm hoping that by now listeners, doing whatever they are doing as they listen to this podcast, are getting the case for friendship with God and friendship with other people. So let's think practically, and particularly as we talked about that high vision of friendship, about honesty, transparency, being there for friends. People are probably thinking, "Oh my goodness, there's only a limited number of people I can do that with." What would be the practical tips we'd be wanting to give that we've really benefit from ourselves when it comes to actually making sure that there are some real, genuine friends in our lives? I mean, Phil, wisdom you've got to share on just making sure that there are some people who justify the term friend in that deeper sense.
Yeah, I mean, you've just hit the nail on the head, Ed, by saying actually there are a limited number of people you can have that with, because I think what's happened over the last few decades, especially the advent of social media, has kind of convinced us that quantity equals quality. And I mean, a lot of people with hundreds, maybe even thousands of Facebook friends who have this illusion of friendship, but we all need those we can call when the storms hit the shores of our life. And so one of the things that I kind of make the case in the book for is that actually we need circles of different levels of intimacy. And, that Jesus demonstrates this in quite a kind of awkward way that often seems unfair. So I was really struck by the very awkward moments in the Gospels where Jesus kind of says to 9 of his disciples, "Boys, you wait there." He says, "Peter, James and John, come with me." And I feel really sorry for a few people. I feel really sorry for the likes of Thomas and Philip, but I also feel really sorry for James the Lesser. I mean, can you imagine him? His name's called You Go Back, Son. Or Andrew, because James and John are brothers and Peter gets to go. And it was Andrew who introduced Peter to Jesus. But actually, it just demonstrates something of Jesus' incredible perception as to what the limits of human relationship are. And I think we need a really honest conversation about having limited relational capacity. And then what's fascinating is, as I've kind of dived into the science of friendship a bit more, the latest kind of sociologists, anthropologists recognise the upper limit of the number of meaningful connections we can have is about 150. But then they've asked how much, by the way, if you've not got 150 friends, don't worry, that's the kind of upper limit. But then what they've done is they've said, how many good friends can you have? How many great friends can you have? Turns out you can have about 12 good friends and about 3 great friends. And I'm like, as I'm reading this from these non-Christian anthropologists, I'm like, that sounds really familiar. It's like Jesus had help. Do you know what I mean? And so I think what I'd urge those listening to this is to think about who are the few people, 1, 2 or 3 people who you can really invest in. And that doesn't diminish necessarily the kind of quality of the outsells. We need those as well. We need people who, I have some good friends who I just have superficial conversation with. Small talk's great, But actually, there are some people who and I think that a kind of helpful framework of how we think about that is frequency of connection. So I've got some people in my life, some friends who I make a real effort to be in at least weekly contact with. And then think in terms of what that looks like in terms of both text messaging, phone calls, actually meeting up, and thinking about that. Those are the principles we've talked about when we talked about quality of time with God. Time, vulnerability, presence. Think about those for our inner circle. But we do need those people who we can really, really invest in. That's where the gold is, I think, in friendship.
Have you done that, Phil? Has it happened naturally, or did you actually have to say? I mean, have you said to some people, "You're one of my part. You're one of the inner circle," and other people have you said, "Unfortunately, you didn't make the cut."
No, I think actually I'm very, very deliberate about not telling people. Certainly in those those outside, but I think, but I actually do say in the book I dedicate the book to my inner circle, which is my best mate, my brother, my sister, and my wife. And actually, what I would say is those that and people will probably resonate with this. That inner circle changes a bit as well. It's not like you kind of set it at 25, and that's you for 50 years. I think that can shift, and there can be some people who are more important at different times than others. But I think the only way I found for that to happen is being really intentional, and kind of especially with my best friend, we have to really make sure every week there's specific time, and if one of us drops the ball on that, there's an ache and a pain within that. But that's come of years, decades of trying to do that. I think the other thing I'd finally say, because I recognise there's a lot of pain, and over the last few years there's a lot of pain around this, is actually, as Christians, we do have a huge advantage when it comes to knowing God, the great connector in this. I really believe, and I'm sure for you guys, you can think maybe your friendship with each other, maybe you disagree, but I think there's some people who you just look back and go, that can only be God who's made that connection happen. And I think we're this great advantage as Christians where I don't think we pray enough for the friends we don't have, as well as the friends we do. And so often when I find myself going into rooms of people or going to church or whenever it is, just saying, Lord, would you just help me? Would you just help me connect with the people I need to connect with today? And my prayer for all of us as followers of Jesus and of not is that actually we find the people we can really invest in, because God really does have people for everybody.
So that's sort of an intentionality there, but then also it's not a spontaneity, but a spontaneity that you're asking God to control.
Yeah, well, but that's what it is. That's life as a follower of Jesus, isn't it? Right. We surrender all of ourselves to Him, but I think actually we're probably not very good at trusting God in this. In all kinds of other ways we trust God. But many of us actually have never prayed the prayer, Lord, would you connect me? But my theological basis for that is Jesus on the cross, where the Son of God is dying for the sins of the world, and yet has the presence of mind to say to his mother, Mum, here is your son, and to John, here is your mother. He is the great connector, and I think we need to pray more of those prayers.
Andy, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I love that, and praying about friendships is something we don't model well, but is vital. I guess recognizing that we're different personalities as well. So probably there have been times in life where there has been a loneliness and thinking, how do I create friendships? I'm pretty shy by temperament, and so creating friendships with people I don't know that well has always been terrifying to me. And so for those listening to this and thinking, yeah, but I just don't form friendships easily, I'm quite shy, how do I get to know people? I guess I'd be saying just try and take little steps. So it might be if there's, you really don't feel like there's anybody you know well at the moment and you're in a church context, maybe it is inviting one or two people round or to go out for coffee. Or maybe for some, the little step is, there are people I know, but I've never been particularly open with them. And just trying to initiate a conversation which actually maybe asks a question about, I sometimes ask you what's been good, what's been bad this week, and try, or something like that, and it just gets a degree of openness going. And so it might be, rather than, for some people it will just be, what is the little step I can take on this, if actually it's an area of some difficulty for us.
Yeah, I would go further and say have a question.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Do you know what I mean? And actually be ready. So I mean, this is completely showing my hands to everybody who ever meets me ever. But my question I always ask is, what keeps you busy when you're not here on a then kind of time of day? And to be honest, I'm quite outgoing, but I'm actually quite introverted. But I have learned over time, unless I'm prepared before I go into that conversation,
that's helpful.
I can often go, what do I say? Have a question, doesn't matter what it is, but that's mine. What keeps you busy when you're not here? It's great. It gives people permission to talk about their job or their passions or their hobbies or whatever, and it's great.
Yeah.
And then it's wonderful, isn't it, how God has also designed it so that actually is how vulnerability breeds intimacy. So actually, and sometimes the vulnerability might be, I'm really struggling with loneliness. And actually, that is the thing that breeds the intimacy as you just share that. And sometimes you'll find you're vulnerable with people and they don't respond. And actually, that's quite handy because you think clearly not going to be a good friend. But other times you are open and people respond to your vulnerability with the vulnerability. And I found that is the moment where friendship's made, isn't it? You're vulnerable and open. Somebody responds in kind, and just even in that transaction, horrible way of putting it, transaction of vulnerability, that is how friendship grows, isn't it? You've been open and honest, people respond with open honesty, and boy, that's the manure for some very good friendship.
Yeah, and just back to one of your previous questions, Ed, about how you form those boundaries without kind of saying you're not in my circle or whatever. Actually, that friendships are kind of dance where you're kind of just working out the boundaries of vulnerability. And sometimes actually if you feel you've got too many really close friends, actually you get to manage some of those boundaries by how much you disclose and how much time you give and that kind of thing. And that can be really difficult, painful. But I think my encouragement would be we've all got limited relational capacity. And if we spread ourselves too thinly, we lose the gold of the real inner circle. The numbers aren't a kind of direct science, but they're helpful guides.
Oh, well, this is a conversation I now want to continue for the rest of the day. We cannot do that. We've used up enough time already. But the good news for anybody listening out there who's thinking, I want to hear more from this Phil Knox guy on friendship, is he has written this fantastic book called The Best of Friends. And the subtitle is Choose Wisely and Care Well, which is something you've probably picked up already from Phil. He's got a lot of practical advice on. As I said earlier, I'm 2 chapters in. I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the stuff, in particular as he goes into the sort of various circles of friendship that he's just talked about. Phil, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a delight to have you with us. Andy, always good to sort of hang out with you.
You're very kind.
And if you've really enjoyed this episode on friendship and you want to hear more, the good news is it's the beginning of a whole series on friendship, and we're going to be back in a couple of weeks' time, spending some time with one of my good friends. You'll hear about more in a couple of weeks' time on the Living Out podcast. Thanks so much for joining us today.